So the second phase of the progressive era is going to be local governments. Local governments. So think about the problems that were going on, and your textbook again talks about these. I'm not going to go on about them too much, but you've got a lot of overcrowding in these urban areas, a lot of unsafe housing that's going on, and a lot of factories and other businesses that are building in these cities that aren't following any safety codes, because no safety codes exist. There are no fire escapes. There is no spacing between the buildings. There are none of these requirements for airflow or anything like that. And they start to have problems in this. So the cities, the buildings are so close together and designed so poorly that there's no airflow between the buildings. And so when a disease hits, which we're experiencing this pandemic in 2020, right? When a disease hits, there's no airflow to get it out and to get it moving. Remember, you don't have electricity in most of these buildings. It's very minimal. So you're not going to have, you're not going to have air conditioning. You're not going to have electric fans. You're not going to have those kinds of things. So you have a lot of really unsafe air quality in the tenement housing where people lived in very overcrowded conditions because the workers were so poor, they're so poorly paid, and your textbook talks about this, so poorly paid and so poor that they were overcrowded. There was no plumbing to speak of, and certainly not to our standards today. So think of the smell. I always think, if we could just bring back the smells of the past, people would never go to war and would never live in overcrowded housing or any of these problems. But think about those realities and how unhealthy they're going to be, a breeding ground for tuberculosis and all sorts of nasty diseases that are going to kill people and make them quite miserable when they're alive. So you have all sorts of housing problems. And it's in 1890 that New York City becomes the first city to announce building codes, where you have to meet certain standards, certain safety standards, certain space between the buildings, fire escapes, more windows for ventilation, different things like this, because it just was getting unsafe and people were getting sick and dying, and that being sick is bad for the economy. Right? And bad for reality. Your textbook also talks about the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, and there's a great video on that as well. So the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in Chicago was a horrible factory accident. And this goes back to some of the things your textbook author talked about, this idea that people were being locked in to their workspaces. The employers were worried that the women, these were seamstresses, they were making their shirts. If you think of women in that era with their long shirts with their long dresses, skirts over them, it was the shirts. And they were in there sewing them. If any of you sew, you know that, if you're cutting a lot of fabric and sewing a lot of things, the air can get kind of dusty and filled with the lint from the fabric. So these women were in there. A fire begins, and the women can't get out. The doors are locked. The one person that had a key was the supervisor, and he fled the building. So these young women are trapped in this building and can't escape. And so you have many of them that, the people of Chicago are on the streets. The fire department comes, but there's no ladder that comes up high enough to reach those women. And there's no hoses that work to get the fire out fast enough. And so people on the street sit and watch in horror as young women jump from the building rather than being caught in the fire. And it was a horrible tragedy captured in the news and the newspaper and described in great detail. Something like 146 young women were killed in this accident. And this leads to development of commissions and councils and different local government organizations in cities across the country to try to improve the safety in these factories. So while tragic events like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire really helped spur the cities into making codes and talking about these things, during this era you also have changes at the state level where the state governments are going to start to get involved. And these are efforts that had grown out of that populist movement that your textbook talked about. I didn't talk about it much, but your textbook talked about the populists in the last chapter. And at the state level, you're going to get more changes at a bigger level, at reforms when it comes to politics and things like that. The state of Wisconsin leads the way on this, and they have a number of things called the Wisconsin Plan, where they're going to have direct primaries, which is a political change where people can vote in a primary election to elect a senator or representatives, rather than a bunch of old white guys sitting in a small room smoking their cigars deciding who's going to run and who's going to be the candidate for their political party. The people can vote in those primary elections. They also have railroad regulations. And this is something where the populists, again, as your textbook talked about, these farmers were really being hurt by the railroads that would charge some people more and some people less. And they would charge more when the crops came in, and they knew that the farmers were stuck, and less later. Kind of like when the airlines charge more over Christmas, right? Or Thanksgiving, the tickets are more because the demand is more. Well, the railroads were doing that, and it was really hurting the farmers. So the state of Wisconsin said, on the rail lines in our state, you're going to charge the same for everybody. It's going to be the same rate, whether it's a local farmer or an industrial guy or somebody who has invested in your railroad. The rates are going to be regulated, and they're going to be fair and even across the board. They also implemented an income tax, a state income tax, so the wealthier people would have to donate, and they could help grow their infrastructure and things like that. Most states in the United States have an income tax. Texas does not, which is one of the reasons it's considered friendly for business and individuals. Florida does not. I don't think Tennessee does any longer either. And Alaska does not. Alaska, they pay you to be there. Civil service is created in this Wisconsin plan. The idea of this is rather than government officials being able to hire whoever they want to fill positions, that if you're going to work for the government in the bureaucracy of the government, you have to meet certain standards. You have to pass a civil service exam and be separate from the politics of the era. And then the big thing of this Wisconsin plan was state-owned utilities. Again, this is something that the populists wanted as well. They wanted the state government to control, water or electricity or, down the road phones or something like that. Because if you live in the country, it costs more to get those things because it takes it further to get it to you and things like that. Whereas if the government runs it, the profit margin doesn't have to be as high. So this Wisconsin plan just really serves as an example for other states, and that's why we talk about that state plan. And then there's the fourth phase, or the fourth part of the progressive era, and that's really the changes at the federal government level. So you have a number of presidents who are, some are more progressive than others. Your textbook author has a whole section on this. The one that we really think of as being very progressive and a really activist president is Theodore Roosevelt. I think it's important to recognize that he was very young. He was the vice president for William McKinley, who was elected president in 1900. William McKinley was assassinated in 1901, and Theodore Roosevelt becomes president. He's only 42 years old, which is really young. You have to be 35 or older to be president, but 42 was the youngest. And he proposes a square deal. Theodore Roosevelt does. Now, if you think about a square deal, what do you think about? What do you think that means? Right? Well, think of a square. All four sides of a square are equal. So the idea of a square deal is that it's a fair deal. It's equal for everybody involved. Everybody has an equal share, an equal chance. And he was really an activist president. He was very sick as a child. He was, so his parents had him spend a lot of time outdoors, and he became a great outdoorsman. He was a big game hunter. He swam, he hiked, he did everything. He was very much an outdoorsman. And he was definitely an activist president, wanting to make change and move things forward. There are a number of different acts that he pushes forward: the Elkins Act, the Hepburn Act, which deal with the railroads and regulation of the railroads. Other things that he's very well known for is conservation. And he wasn't a conservationist. He was a conservationist, but he wasn't in the way we sometimes think of it today, where, sometimes you think of a conservationist, you think of somebody who wants to preserve every tree and every bush and every bird, every fish. And that's not what he was. He was a hunter, but he was more about management and land management and conserving open spaces and keeping those spaces protected. So he really advocated the government as manager of those natural resources, of that wilderness. He grabs up thousands of acres of land for national parks and national forests, many of whom we still have today. He also believes in development, careful development of these natural spaces. So you have federal money going into western dams and reservoirs and canals. So he preserves the space, but he also utilizes the space. So he's interesting in that way. A number of other things that come out under Teddy Roosevelt's presidency. There was a really good book, and I've had students read it in the past. Maybe you read it in high school, called The Jungle. The Jungle was a book by Upton Sinclair. It comes out in 1906. Comes out in 1906. And this is a book about immigrant family that comes from Eastern Europe. And it's very poignant. They come to the United States, and they come to Chicago, and there's a couple in it that gets married, and they're in love, and in reality, every horrible thing that can happen to somebody happens to these people. It is so bad. All sorts of things happen to them. They all get jobs. Grandma comes and grandpa comes and uncles and aunts and cousins, and the whole group gets there, and the whole community, and they all get jobs in the meat packing plant in Chicago. And Sinclair did his work. He's one of those muckraker investigative journalists. So he did his work before he wrote this. He went and actually worked in the meatpacking plant so he could see what was really going on in them. And then he writes this story, and he talks about the horrible things going on in these factories, these meatpacking plants, where they're slaughtering cattle and other animals, hogs, to pack into metal tins to eat, and how everything gets thrown in the mix. And if a rat falls in, too bad. If somebody cuts their fingers off, too bad. It all gets mixed in the mash. And the acid that they use to clean things and how it burns through the feet of the people that use it. And it's horrible. It's horrible. And the whole experience of this family coming, and the goal of Sinclair was to get people to rise up against the government and rise up, a call for revolution. But what he ends up doing, he says, I aimed for their hearts, but I hit them in the stomach, because people read this story, and the biggest piece that they hang on to is this idea of the stuff that's going into their food, and they have no idea what's going on to their food. And so you have some major legislation that comes out of this book. I've written them down here for us, right? In 1906, the same year as his book comes out, we have two major pieces of legislation that are passed. Theodore Roosevelt is a huge advocate in pushing for this because he read the book as well and was disgusted by it. The first is the Meat Inspection Act. And this is the idea that you're going to have federal inspectors go into the meat packing plants and see what's really going on and make sure that they're not letting the rats go into the food and the fingers and all of those things. And then the second piece, and we still have this today. And then the second piece is the Pure Food and Drug Act. And this is the idea that any food or medicine sold in a package has to be labeled. So anything that you drink has a label on it, right? Right? You guys know the labels. I know exactly what kind of nasty chemicals are in this thing because of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. Anything that you have that is in a package has to have a label. Those labels have gotten more detailed as science has changed and expectations have changed. But the idea was, you couldn't just say it's meat. Well, what kind of meat and what else is in there, right? What other food is in there? Oh, here's your medicine. Well, what's in that medicine? Is it just cocaine and sugar, which is what a lot of things were at that time, or what exactly is it? So these two pieces come out of this legislation in this time period, or come out of this book, and we're still using them today with the inspection of plants and the Pure Food and Drug Act. So the reality of the federal government being very active in this time period is still with us. Now, the final president who was considered a progressive president but is now maybe not as much as he used to be is Woodrow Wilson, who came later. And we'll talk about him a little bit more in our World War I lectures. But he is, some of the legislation that comes out under him when he is president is kind of seen as a high point in the progressive era. The 16th Amendment, which has the income tax, the Federal Trade Commission, which helps determine if businesses are behaving legally and acceptable for the government, that kind of thing. So again, we'll talk more about Wilson in our World War I lectures. But this is kind of, I think the textbook does a really good job of talking about progressivism and talking about some of the different movements, along with the suffrage movement for women. It also talks about the birth control movement and different aspects of that, this idea of pushing forward the rights for women as far as they can go. Because again, before this period, really before the 1960s and 1970s, birth control was illegal for women, so they had no, if you got married, you were getting pregnant and going to have lots of babies. There was no real ability to control it. Of course, pregnancy and childbirth is the most dangerous thing women do. Anyone does, even to this day. So your textbook does a good job with all of this. I hope that you'll read it carefully. But my hope is that this gives you a little bit understanding and you can see how progressivism was working at all these different levels. Okay.